Assalamu alaikum guys, this is Ahmed Mauer aka Mr. Middle Path, and this is a quick introduction into what we're going to be covering throughout these three-part series on weed use throughout Muslim history and the distinction between Muslim history and Islamic history. Islamic history being the history that we take that is sacred, that Muslims can form religious rulings out of and use those events to make a legal interpretation out of that. Such events would obviously be the life of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. It also includes, but is not limited to, the founding generations, most of what they did and much of what the actions that they made and that they said. Most Muslims, almost all Muslims, would consider that as sacred, and you can extract religious rulings from that. There are other events as well that Muslims would consider as part of Islamic history, and Islamic history and Muslim history overlap. It's not like, bang, this is Islamic history, bang, that's Muslim history. No, they overlap with each other. Muslim history, though, would be things that, for better or for worse, the actions of Muslim people, for better or for worse, that is just, it's not sacred. You're not going to take a religious ruling out of it, even if it's for the better. And if it's for the worse, then, that's still irrelevant. That's still Muslim history. Now, that being said, that's why I chose the name weed use throughout Muslim history, because I didn't want people to think that, oh, it's okay to smoke weed in Islam, or like some other, I don't know what people think about when they watch these videos. So that's why it was very important for me to put this intro out. And part one will talk about a general overview of the history that the Muslim Ummah went through. When exactly in this history did weed use start to become known, and in what form was it consumed in, and how did the doctors use it? Because at first it was introduced as a medicine, and this was introduced 200 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So again, how the scholars looked at it, because this was something new that they didn't have access to before, so they didn't know how to put a ruling on it, and what decisions they made to make the ruling on it. Nowadays, obviously, all scholars think that weed use is forbidden. How did the scholars view it in the past is something that will be looked at a little bit in part one, but mainly in part two. Part two will also go into more about what the scientists viewed it as, and then we'll cover in part one and part two. Part one will cover mainly the general history, but part two will also cover how the poor people viewed it, and also how some poets viewed it and what they wrote about it as well. Part three will go into a more interesting section where how the rulers and the warrior classes viewed it and the soldiers viewed it and what they did. So an example would be a king that thought that weed use was hurting the effectiveness of his troops. I mentioned who that was and what his accomplishments were and the edicts that he made and what the effects were. And then we try and move up all the way till present day. In present day, obviously, weed use is still a problem in Muslim societies and in non-Muslim societies as well. And the conversations that people were having about weed today are very similar to the conversations that were happening back then. And we're going to go into more depth and more detail in that, inshallah, right now. Without further ado, let us begin. Assalamu alaikum everyone. This is Mr. Middle Path aka Ahmed Mauer, and we are back to part two of weed use in Muslim history. Okay, so I was talking last time about how doctors would prescribe it at one point, and this is part two. So physician Al-Razi, who lived in Spain at the time, so most likely this was the Umayyad dynasty. I don't have the exact date of when he was alive, but you will find the link in the description to my sources, okay? So physician Al-Razi used it for dandruff, ear infections, literally like you'd extract the hashish into some liquid form and you'd put it in the ear, gassiness, and epilepsy and seizures. This is a big one, right? Epilepsy and seizures is even till this day, and we're going to talk about this when I talk about scientific studies on hash and marijuana right now, is that it's scientists believe today that it can be used for neurological disorders that affect your nervous system. And back then, what the Muslim doctors were doing was using it for epilepsy and seizures, which is a big deal. Now, what did they say the side effects were? Main thing was euphoria and lethargy, which means laziness, being stupid, basically. So, they know the usual stuff. Is a demon opening the door. No, I'm just kidding, guys. They note the usual stuff, which is dryness of the mouth, cotton mouth, redness of the eye,
excessive sleepiness in higher doses. I'm reading from the thing because it's a lot of stuff. Harms the intestines. Why harms the intestines? Nowadays people smoke weed. Back then people ate hash, as I mentioned in the previous video. So harms the intestines. Negatively affects vision. Loss of stamina. This is a big one because when I go back to the dynasties and how right now we're talking about how the scientists viewed weed, how the doctors view weed. Now we're going to talk about how the scholars viewed it. Then we're going to talk about how the rulers viewed it and the soldiers viewed it. Okay, so I'm going to try and give you guys a big picture of weed use in Islam, in Muslim history, right? So weakening of your senses perception, laziness, loss of stamina, negatively affects vision. They say saps users' energy, ability, and willingness to work. And then this is the big one, right? Mind changing and personality changing. And what's very interesting is that they said that when people start, this is what the doctors would say. So when people start using weed, they become socially happy. They become socially nice and fun to other people. But when weed use prolongs for too long, they become socially withdrawn. And the adjective used is pensiveness, but it's cowardly. Literally, is what they said. Cowardly. They become like little cowards, or they become like little cowards with prolonged weed use. In the beginning, socially free and upbeat and talking to everyone, but after a while, the weed use catches up to them, and they become socially withdrawn cowards and weak. Right? So, inshallah, I'll talk more about that when we go to the poetry that has been talked about weed, and poets would compare weed and alcohol together, right? So that's what the doctors would write, and like I said, they'd have seizures, epilepsy, certain things that they prescribed weed for, and the other main medicine was opium, right? So afyun is an Arabic word, opium, right? Opium, hashish, and afyun, opium and hash. And opium would be used for physical illnesses, physical pain, and these kinds of things. So in our case here, for the purposes of our study, obviously both are intoxicants. Both were considered impermissible by the scholars, except in limited medicinal use from a doctor. And you will have different Shafi'i. The four legal schools in Islam are Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, and Hanafi, right? So all of them said it's forbidden, except the Hanafi, which said that you're allowed to do it in medical use. And interestingly enough, they also said that you're allowed to do it if you're immune to the effects of being high, or if you're taking such a small dose that you're not going to be high. So they had a little bit more of open leeway, but for the most part, they all said that it was impermissible completely. And they also said that only time it could be permissible in medicinal use as prescribed by a doctor's. Now, some of the names, you can look that up. Famous one, Shafi'i scholar Az-Zakarshi, right? Zakarshi, with a qaf or kaf, I don't know, remarked that the use of hashish could be considered lawful if consumed out of medical necessity, such as anesthesia for amputation. So apparently when they would amputate someone, they'd give them hash. I don't know why they would do that. I'm pretty sure that they'd use opium instead if that was available. But I go outside of the scope of my expertise here. Please read the sources and you will see everything. It's like a 18-page, 20-page excerpt from a book on Islamic history, Muslim history, from different sources. So anyways, what did the poets say about it, right? The poets said about it that, and poets are more, free and open, and they wouldn't care about what was permissible, what was impermissible. They'd live their life the way they wanted to. And they would write that essentially weed is compatible with being weak and indecisive, but it gets you smacked and it gets you feeling real nice, and it gets you opening you to some type of spiritual perception that you may not have been open to before. Whereas alcohol is compatible with worldly power and decisive action, right? So these were the two things that they write. And they also wrote that both of them, alcohol and weed, are great for sex, right? But the doctors would say that as well. Doctors also said that weed is good for sex, but prolonged use of marijuana, of hash, would lead to sexual impotency, right? So again, now, we talked about the poets. We talked about the scholars. We talked about and I said in part 1 that a certain Sufi, the Haydari Tariqa, would use it. What did other Sufis say about it? So the famous Sufis that are accepted by mainstream Muslims, like Imam al-Ghazali, who wrote Ihya Ulumuddin, rahimahullah, a man I respect a lot, and his book is amazing, although it has some mistakes in it in terms of hadith authenticity. But hadith means sayings of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So all of these, the real, what I call real Sufis, condemned hash use for whatever purposes, spiritual or not, right? And they said that using hash, because the Haydari Tariqa and some other Sufis, so-called Sufis, would use it to get to the next level spiritually, whereas the real Sufis that were accepted by the mainstream Muslim Ummah and wrote many books on the realities of spirituality, the science of spirituality, Ihya Ulumuddin, written by Imam Ghazali, literally means revival of the religious sciences or revival of the spiritual sciences. And he wrote a book on the soul, how to dominate your ego, how to tell if your ego is, and many other scholars wrote books on differentiating between, for example, whether an idea that comes in your head is from Satan or whether an idea that comes in your head is from your own ego, and how to know. Very fascinating books. And all of these people condemned what other groups were doing and said, no, you're not allowed to do hash for spiritual purposes. This is false, and this is a perversion of the Islamic way of getting closer to God, because in Islam we don't, and especially when it comes to spirituality, we don't do anything that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did not do. Okay, so that was their main contention against certain, and I don't say all Sufi groups are deviant. No, I'm going to say that every single group in Muslim history had their deviant people and had their people that were upon what Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was doing. So I was just trying to show you guys the history of the two different things. Interestingly enough, the assassins, right? I'm sure you guys played Assassin's Creed, or you know of it, right? The assassins during the Crusader area were called the Hashashin, right? And it was Marco Polo who writes that that the man who controlled the castle and the Alamut, I believe it was, he would feed people hash elixir to kind of indoctrinate them and brainwash them. And some other people say that story isn't true, and that Hashashin, the term Hashashin, came from mainstream Muslim scholars who basically said, oh, he's a hashash, like he's a pothead, he's a nobody, his beliefs are retarded, basically as a way of demeaning him, because the Hashashin were said that they were Muslims, but they were not actually Muslims. They were a branch of the Ismaili sect of the Shias. And I'm not saying that Shias are not Muslim, but I'm saying that branch of Shiaism was known for a lot of deviances and weird beliefs, and they don't really exist today anymore. And all scholars have kind of agreed that what they believed in was I mean, he was feeding people hash to get them indoctrinated to assassinating his political enemies. So that is enough of its own. That order was destroyed when the Mongols invaded, and they crushed that castle. They crushed it to dust. So, anyways, going back now, right? We're going to talk about the rulers and the military conquests in part 3, and what role, how the rulers viewed hash use, and also how the common people viewed hash use, and why it was so widespread at one point in Muslim history. And hopefully this gives you guys an idea of what we talk about today in society already happened 1,000 years ago. The collective Muslim wisdom that we have since Prophet Muhammad ﷺ till now is quite a lot, and usually you will find the answers that you're looking for. If you have a specific question of problems that you have today, you will find these answers in the past. So knowing your history is very important, and hopefully if you aren't a Muslim, you found this beneficial as well. I love you guys. Assalamu alaikum, and take care.